Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Anti-Oedipus reading group. This is session 2 for the first section. And the syllabus is below, but the first section is the entirety of the first chapter, the desiring machines. Today's reading group, it'll just be me and I guess Sam here is the other participant. As far as like is at this moment. I do not know if anybody else will be joining us, but this reading group is still open. I like to preface that at the front because a lot of people only listen to the beginning of a video. There's a way in the description below on how to join this. There's a Discord link there. Just specify in the introduction or general channel that you're here for the Anti-Oedipus reading group, and I can add you in. You can either join in the reading group sessions like this, so we can have an expanded amount of thought added to as we go into the second through fifth sections of this. But if you don't want to join the reading group, it's always nice to be in the channel itself and being able to talk about these concepts. We've had multiple people who have not yet shown up for a live reading recording that have helped us with the understanding of stuff like the body with organs. Sam here actually provided an example I thought was in the book in the last reading session. I just wanted to preface that the hurricane stuff I talked about. They have mentioned that that was actually them in the Discord chat. Where'd you get that from again?
It was an example that was used on the In Our Time podcast. It's a BBC podcast, and it's specifically the episode on complexity. And also, it wasn't about the body without organs specifically. It was about basically someone asked what Deleuze and Guattari meant when they talked about something being emergent, the phenomenon of emergence. And basically, I just used the example of a hurricane to kind of show how like kind of these lower level things of just like little droplets of water flying around builds into this kind of like larger emergent structure of a hurricane. And like that's kind of an idea that's floating in the background of some of, well, actually process ontology generally, but also Deleuze and Guattari.
Yeah, because they do take a little bit from Whitehead. I know that's probably one of the few English people they actually like.
Yeah,
Philosophers
yeah,
at least.
yeah. Actually, I want to introduce a concept from actually. Have you read Difference of Repetition yet?
I've read the first chapter on. I'm trying to remember the order because the introduction is mostly about repetition, and I believe the first chapter is on difference. I've read and gotten through those,
Yeah,
so I've not made it to the image of thought yet.
yeah. First chapter is on introduction is kind of on difference. First chapter is no. Introduction is kind of on repetition. First chapter is on difference. Second chapter is on repetition. Third chapter is the gem of the book, the image of thought.
Yeah.
And then you have two chapters and a conclusion. And Whitehead is mentioned in the conclusion in probably the funniest way possible. It's the only place he's mentioned in the entire book, but it is basically Deleuze is talking about how we have to start thinking about things in terms of becoming rather than this like active becoming rather than being. And I'm trying to find it in my copy of and basically like he's talking about all this stuff and he says, which makes Process and Reality by Whitehead one of the greatest books of modern philosophy. And so just like only mention of Whitehead says it's one of the greatest works of philosophy. And it's like, I think it is a good example of what Deleuze scholar Daniel W. Smith has called
From Purdue.
On Machine Unconscious Happy Hour podcast, he's mentioned it in both the episodes he's in. Husserl's idea of like thematic concepts versus operative concepts. A thematic concept is like desiring machine or body without organs, whereas basically a thematic concept is like something a philosopher is actually arguing for. It's like it's what they're talking about, whereas an operative concept is something that's functioning in the background. And concepts like immanence, concepts like process ontology, individuation, those are kind of working in the background of most of Deleuze's work.
Yeah, I've definitely had references like that. I cite them sometimes just to I have cited them in the past to get kind of past, like if I have a cite quota of 6 and I'm at 5 or something. I've cited Foucault's what is it? The Order of Thought, which is
Order of
the
things.
yeah, the Order of Things. The Order of Thought's just a conglomeration of different titles, sorry. Yeah, the Order of Things, which I'd read halfway through, and I was like, well, this reading this book did inform my opinions on everything that I spoke about here. So I guess I kind of have to include it as a reference just to like
Mm.
get over the line. Because and then there's times where I feel bad where I'm like, I know I'm getting this like 5 paragraph structure from having read this book in the past, but I don't reference the book once. It's just kind of it's become part of my thought now. And I'm like 50-50 on like whether I shouldn't or shouldn't. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, mattering like how absolutely important it is to understand where the book came from or where that thought came from.
I could probably cite Deleuze like that in probably everything that I've ever written, uh, just because he kind of got to me early.
Yeah. I had a finals paper recently where I was like basically using Lacan as a way to kind of like using Lacan as a puppet to try and sneak in Deleuze and Guattari's schizoanalysis instead, which
Mm.
is probably a huge no-no to the Lacanians, but I'm a schizoanalyst anyway, in preference to psychoanalysis. So, um, and we didn't go over Deleuze in class, so I couldn't use him. So I had to get him in some way.
Yeah,
Uh, But I guess I want to start us on the same question I started the last reading group. Um, I guess primarily for you because I did kind of answer it there. Um, what text kind of I don't know if this is your first reading or not, but
it
what
is.
text are you kind of bringing into your understanding of Deleuze and Guattari? Whether that be other texts by the two that you have read before, um, or just kind of the associated text, or just completely unrelated text. All 3 fields are applicable here.
Mm.
And it,
So just the kind of the Deleuze and Guattari that I've read before. I've read a few plateaus of 1,000
yeah,
plateaus.
always
Um,
helpful.
yeah, I've read Difference of Repetition, and I've read a few of their well, no, a few of Deleuze's essays, some of which were written around this time, or no, around the time of 1,000 Plateaus. And so like it uses a lot of the same terminology.
Yeah,
Um,
I know the
uh,
book on Kafka references a lot of the concepts that will be found later in
yeah,
A Thousand
yeah.
Plateaus.
I really wish that I picked that up when I had the chance. Picked that up at the bookstore. I saw it on the shelf and I was just like, Kafka, I don't
It's
have
honestly like a day read. I finished it in like 2 days.
it. I
Um,
read slowly. So yeah, but I think probably a better example, a better one that's a bit more distant. I mentioned earlier when talking about operative concepts, individuation, and basically I was just like the reason I wasn't in the first session was because like I was just feeling a bit down. And so to cure that, for some reason I read Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information by Gilles Simondon, translated by Taylor Adkins of the
yeah,
Machine Unconscious Happy Hour
reference
podcast.
to them again. I referenced
Yeah,
them in the last one. They are the seminar podcast that we are following, as well through the reading of Anti-Oedipus. Um,
I've listened to every single one of their Anti-Oedipus seminars, and
and I'm listening to them
yeah,
again. So
and I will be listening to them again. But basically with Simondon, I just read the introduction, which basically has everything in it. It has everything in it, and so basically,
it's what a
like,
good introduction is,
yeah, yeah, it's I think,
arguably.
yeah, I think Taylor Adkins described it as basically having basically it all being kind of coiled up, compressed like a spring, and that's kind of like that's why the introduction is a bit more difficult than the rest of the book. Also, why it's a good introduction, but basically individuation is kind of this weird problem, and it's linked to something that Deleuze and Guattari talk about. That being the distinction between being and becoming. And so like basically Simondon thinks about this by partially by drawing on modern science, but also going back to kind of like these two ways of thinking the individual. How does the individual exist, and how does it come to be? And he's focusing on how it comes to be, that being becoming or individuation. And so basically, you have either the hylomorphic path, where it's like you have this kind of, which is Aristotle's view, this ideal form of a thing, like for instance, the form of a human, or the form of a table, or the form of like a rock or something like that. You have a form and you have this matter, and the matter doesn't really do anything. It's the form which makes the matter into the thing. And then you have kind of the substantialist path, where it's like you have this approach where it's like, okay, we have people walking around, we have tables, chairs, we have all this stuff in the world. If you break it all down, it's just atoms. And that is the individual, where it's just like, and basically Simondon looks at this, and it's always just like, okay, we always start with the concept of the individual. We always, actually, I'm going to cut this short. I have started on a tangent. Sorry about that. But
I'll do them too.
Basically, we have this view of individuation, how things come to be, this process of becoming, which is always thought about in terms of the individual that we get at the end. And so in response to this, Simondon, among other things, he jettisons the concept of form and replaces it with information, and then introduces energy. Basically, the individual for him is not just an individual. It is this pairing of an individual, this milieu, and it is all thought in terms of matter, energy, and information. And so basically, it's a system. It's not this static object. It's a system. And basically, just reading the first chapter of Anti-Oedipus, like they're talking about things in motion. They're talking about machines. They're talking about things plugging into other things. It's all about this flow, this operation. And like you can't really find any kind of strict form in this kind of like Aristotelian form in Deleuze and Guattari. And it's because they're like structure for them, the structure of a thing, what makes it the thing it is always this kind of like immanent, internal, systematic information.
That's
does
kind
that
of
make any sense?
Yeah, that's it's kind of where we finished off last time with the last reading group. It kind of makes, I guess this topic kind of does make it where if you watch the last one, there's somewhat of a bridge here, because we kind of did with the chapter on the whole and its parts. We discussed it a few times. I don't know if it was always at the exact end, but kind of in contrast to a lot of other thinkers, I guess, particularly Hegel with like a dialectical view of history and maybe the development of a person. If I guess Hegel does believe it can be applied at all levels, the dialectic can.
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't want to apply to all possible Hegelians. But there's always something like incomplete. Like the parts don't. The true person that somebody is who they are at the end of their lives in a way. For this type of view, there's something incomplete. They need all the parts to be there. Whereas for Deleuze and Guattari, and I guess Simondon would probably be the same. And most Deleuzians to follow probably end up agreeing with this. There's this kind of whole structure that you have to be able to find. You have to be able to find and look at all the processes that are going on through it, the different flows, the interactions between what makes it up. And that's when you understand someone. It's not when you find out what is incomplete with somebody. The person is already complete. They're complete at every moment. They're just differently complete at every different moment. I guess the one thing I was thinking of was like it. This is a huge time gap, but if you took me now and you took the me of I don't know 8 to 9 years ago who hadn't been through any different relationships, if you're going to schizoanalyze both of us, if you're going to ask what our desiring machines are, you're going to get two completely different answers because we've been through not completely different, but two different experiences where I have 8 years of different desires being produced inside of me, or outside of me being internalized, etc. These I have, I guess, completely or not completely. I have relatively different organs than the me 10 years ago had. Not in a physical sense, but in the Deleuze and Guattari sense. I've desire in a different way than I used to. But that doesn't make me in the future any more complete than me when I was 14. Um, I
Yeah.
don't. Does that kind of what you're trying to get at there?
Yeah. I mean, Deleuze and Guattari talk about this very precisely on page 2 of the Penguin edition. A schizophrenic out for a walk is a better model than a neurotic lying on the analyst's couch. A breath of fresh air, a relationship with the outside world. It's about it's about like it's about understanding the individual in its relations and its kind of like how it is in process within this greater milieu. It's like, I mean, Deleuze also talks about this like as early as his Hume book, which was basically the French version of his MA thesis, where basically he's talking about how like you can't really do a psychology. You can't really do a psychology of a human being, but instead you can do a psychology of what affects us. Because basically it's just like you can't talk about man in this kind of like rigid, general, universal sense. You can't talk about the individual man. You have to talk about the stuff that's coming into us that is producing us. And like, and basically that's why like psychology has to be historical, sociological, economic, aesthetic.
Yeah. We're skipping a little bit ahead to chapter 3. I don't really mind that because
Oh,
just
sorry.
it is just the two of us, so it's not really a problem. But
Okay.
the the Hume book is one I've been meaning to get back to. I have a friend who took a Deleuze and Guattari class back in when they were getting their masters like 10 or
Mm.
so years ago, maybe even more. But they were telling me that the Hume book's like a day read, like 80 100 pages or so, I think. I'm not completely
Mm.
sure. I mean, if it is the equivalent of a master's thesis, um, it can't be this long. I guess it would
Yeah.
maybe like half of it. But also because like it does seem to me that if I'm going to understand schizoanalysis properly, maybe what both of them are bringing to it, and not just Guattari, because I guess Guattari is bringing a lot more of the psychoanalytic qualities to
Yeah.
the what schizoanalysis ends up being by the end of the book. But I guess what Deleuze is also bringing us this kind of empiricism to it, or like radical empiricism to it, in that Freud, throughout his entire criticism of Freud, he thinks Freud is assuming way too much like rationalism, I guess, in a way, and that the
Yeah.
family he's universalizing the family when Deleuze and Guattari are kind of like, whoa, family's still there, but it's not a universal concept. It is something that they experience through being a part of the world. It's not something primordial. It's not some universal myth. It is
Yeah.
something they experience through being a child of a father or a mother, and will be different if they're the child of a single mother, a single father, two mothers, two fathers, three mothers, and five fathers, or something like that. Whatever their family dynamic is going to be different for them, and I see that kind of coming through Deleuze's Hume back some or Hume background or whatever you want to call it,
Yeah.
because Freud is assuming this universal structure, and Deleuze is coming in as a skeptic and being like, no, we can't start with the structure. We actually have to start with how any possible structure could be made. And that means that the subject is on the periphery, which they kind of discuss here,
Yeah.
which I meant to start this rant with the subject being on the periphery. Um, and that the person that ends up at me talking right now, the personality I have is the last part of the process of the person in a way, with
Yeah.
the body with organs being, I guess, the original part, the non-productive core of the whatever I am. I don't know. I don't know if individual is the right term or not once you get to postmodernism or post-structuralism. But
Mm.
I guess that's the closest English term for the word I'm trying to use. But like I am the end of the production cycle, and if you want to understand the production cycle, you can't just study me. You also have to understand what produces me at every single moment. Is that kind of where you're leaning towards as well?
Yeah, yeah, that is kind of what I'm leaning towards. I will say that with that is the kind of empiricism is what Deleuze is bringing, but I think specifically in an analytic context, that's a lot of what Guattari is bringing as well. Because like basically, as I understand it, partially through a bit of Thousand Plateaus and
Yeah,
listening to,
I don't want to say
yeah,
Guattari. I didn't mean to say if I came off that way that Guattari wasn't also bringing that. I think it's one of their biggest points of agreement where you can kind of see them both
mhm.
bring talking. They're both talking with the same mouth in a way.
Yeah, but basically like Guattari, to like put that in the kind of Guattarian terms, like the basically the problem with the analyst is that under this kind of like what we might call bad Freudianism, where it's like Freud at his worst, psychoanalysis at its worst. It's kind of like basically the analyst knows what's wrong with the patient before the patient even says anything. In the sense that like basically like when a little bit later on when they go over like the Schreber case, the Wolfman, Ratman. I don't know if that's an Anti-Oedipus. It is in Thousand Plateaus. There is talk about that in Thousand Plateaus,
If
but
it
it's
is,
like,
it's in the next case. I know they
yeah,
do bring up some of those. I own them. I need to read them, but
yeah, so do
yeah, I get what
I.
you're talking. I do have
Yeah, but basically, it's like
the basic background.
in the most basic sense, Freud isn't listening to these people. He's not listening to the patient, at least not in this open sense. I know that Guattari said somewhere, I forget where I saw this, but like he said somewhere where it's just like when a patient says, I feel purple or something like that, you have to take that seriously and understand in what sense that makes sense to them, rather than kind of like taking it and like integrating it into the pre-given structure of Oedipus. And basically, like, I mean, it's kind of a when all you have is a hammer. Everyone looks like a
Nail.
insufficiently Oedipalized person.
Yeah. I get what you're saying. There was something I brought up, I think last time with I know Acid Horizon has put it on their Twitter when they posted one of Deleuze's interviews. I believe it's somewhere in the it's got to be by the 80s or 90s when he's doing this interview, but where he's talking about if he hadn't done philosophy, he would have done law and specifically jurisprudence.
Yeah,
Um, and it's in Deleuze. I mean Deleuze and Guattari work together probably because I still need to read a biography because I mean if I'm going to be spending the rest of my life talking about these figures, I do need to understand their biological or biographical background.
mm,
But I mean, I know they came to the friendship in the late 60s, and it was because Guattari was able to bring stuff to Deleuze, and Deleuze was able to bring stuff to Guattari. But it's also probably because they're coming in at similar points. In that
yeah,
Deleuze, he would have done jurisprudence law because it is a case by case basis, and psychoanalysis and the critique of psychoanalysis is the fact that they have different subjects, but they're not doing it on a case by case basis or
yeah,
basis. They're doing it in that they have this framework and they're just putting you in. They're just being like, okay, answer
yeah,
these sets of questions, and we can give you one of four answers. Um, and we can try and get you back to. We can try to strengthen the ego, or for Lacan, we can try to weaken the ego, because the ego sucks or the ego's super cool, mattering on who you are. Um, I know that's a debate in psychoanalysis,
yeah,
but they're coming in. It's just like, no. You gotta do it case by case. Every single person is going to have a different psychology. They're going to have different ways of desiring. And if you're gonna say daddy, mommy, me for literally everything, you're just doing your patients a disservice.
yeah. And in terms of just general style, I know that Guattari, um, this is something that Machine and Unconscious Happy always talked about. Basically, Guattari's style, often that he would do classic analysis, but he would also kind of just like he'd do one thing for a while with a patient, and then at some point be just like, okay, we've done this. Do you want to keep doing this, or do you want to do something different? And it's kind of just like he would like change things up, and it's like this, basically this kind of like, it's a bit more open. It's basically his way of doing analysis, whether psychoanalysis or other kinds of analysis. He would just change things up depending on what the circumstance demanded. It was, I mean, like in a sense, it's not even that they brought it, like it's not even that they either brought things to each other or already had these connections. It's that basically you have Deleuze with this very traditionally philosophical, even unorthodox, but philosophical kind of empiricism, this view of things, this very philosophical critique of all this stuff. And then you had Guattari, who's this practicing analyst. And basically they were kind of doing the same thing, but in different fields. And through meeting and talking to each other, they made these connections between things that were already similar, but really weren't being talked about in the same language. And so basically it was this, it's this intermingling that can't really be fully pulled apart in a very comfortable way. That's how I view it, at least.
Yeah. I mean, I remember, I forget which, if it was Acid Horizon or Machine and Unconscious Happy Hour, but someone on there, either the host or one of the guests, was talking kind of about Deleuze as a philosopher, and Guattari is almost anything that is in the humanities. He's doing all of it.
I think that was Machine and Unconscious Happy Hour.
Yeah. I mean, he is kind of living if an academic could be what they consider schizophrenic and not the clinical definition, but just kind of like moving around, being whatever they functionally need to be. One day he's a philosopher, one day he's a psychoanalyst, one day he's a sociologist, next day he's an anthropologist.
Doing ethology.
Yeah. I mean, this book is just, it is kind of a testament to, I mean, we talked about it in a few sentences in the last reading group, but it is really kind of a shame that I love Deleuze. I love his thinking, but it is kind of a shame that Guattari kind of is put in the secondary position when Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus, the diversity of thought that is in these, or the diversity of fields that exist within these just two books, is absolutely insane, and probably majorly indebted to the fact that Guattari was the one that was behind them. The fact that basically every single chapter, all of the 4 chapters of Anti-Oedipus, every single one is in a different field, if not multiple. The third chapter being in like sociology, ethnology, economics, etc. So many fields at once, and then the final one being like, oh, we're adding a whole new subfield to psychology, by the way, and here's the introduction to that. It's just absolutely astounding what, I guess, one guy was able to study in a single lifetime. I kind of aspire to be that, even though I do read a lot more Deleuze because he is easier and his books are easier to find.
Yeah, one of the reasons that I'm as interested in Guattari as I am is just this. I mean, whether he did it well, like Guattari was talking to other fields. He was like going in. He was making these connections. He was basically jumping fences, and so like
tearing them down, running through them.
Yeah, and like people just don't talk about him as much, and partially, I think this is almost definitely because like you can't put him in a box. It's just like the humanities. Well, I mean, like literature departments can use him. Anthropology, a bit too psychoanalytic. Psychoanalysis, no, he's too weird. And then like philosophy, it's just like, what the hell are you even talking about, man? And it's just like, whereas Deleuze, you can be just like, oh,
yeah, he's a philosophy course, yeah.
Oh yeah, he's a metaphysician. He wrote books on cinema. The Anti-Oedipus, 1,000 Plateaus. Yeah, sure, we'll do that also. And so it's just like, I think that's one of the cool things about capitalism and schizophrenia, but it's also kind of one of the frustrating things because it's just like you go in looking for this relatively comfortable, this like relatively comfortable, like maybe it's a polemic or a
Toolbook.
system or a system. You'll go into it looking for a system, and you just find a whole bunch of stuff, and that stuff is really interesting, but you're kind of bummed because you didn't really get a system. You didn't get the system you wanted.
Yeah, you get like 1,000 starting points, and they're like, here you go. And it's like, no, I wanted you to tell me what to do. I didn't want you to hand me the tools. And it's like you got to pick up the tools that they give you because you're not getting a full system. Just because the book was written doesn't mean socialism is going to come out of it. They're giving you this toolbook on how to like, they're like, this is our guide to how we could possibly completely radicalize the way we live. But the writing is not going to do it alone. You're going to actually have to do something, and you're going to have to pick which one of these 1,000 different ideas we came up with is actually useful for that.
Yeah, I posted something in the Discord about this because like Deleuze, after Anti-Oedipus, he wrote a letter to a harsh critic. That's the title of the piece. But in it, he kind of distinguished between two ways of reading a text. The first being basically trying to kind of divine the chains of signifiers. It's this very rationalist approach. It's the kind of traditional academic approach. You're trying to find the right way, the correct meaning. You're trying to nail everything down. And then you have this second way of doing things where Deleuze associates this with the lay reader as opposed to the academic. And the lay reader basically goes in, and they're kind of like treating it more as a machine than a mystery box. They are making these like,
you there? They seem to have muted or disconnected in some regard. Sorry about that, guys.
Sorry about that.
You're all right. We had a few disconnections last time.
Need to make sure that someone didn't start yelling or anything. I'm not in this building alone.
Yeah, I understand. I live in a dorm most of the year, so
yeah. But basically, the second way of reading, I use the word test in the sense of just like basically treating the text as a machine. It's this series of tools, operations, and you kind of try and put them to use. You test them out, and some concepts will work, some concepts not really. Maybe you tinker with them a bit, improve them. Some just don't really work for you. And one of the main differences between these two readings is that the traditional academic will, when they get stuck, when they reach something that doesn't work for them, they'll get frustrated. They'll blame the author for their mistake. I found a problem. You have done something bad, and I will go after you for it. And then like, whereas the lay reader, they'll just let it go. They'll just let that concept fall away and then just kind of go on with their day. And so it's just, I mean, on the one hand, it's just a lot more life affirming to do that second way of reading. But it's also, yeah.
I saw something, it was a tweet about scholarship recently. I forget if it was one of my mutuals or not, where they were discussing their particular problem with academic scholarship. I mean, I don't want to end up doing like Deleuze scholarship. That's kind of one of my fears. I want to take Deleuze and run with it, and do my own thing and show the world like what paintings of philosophy I could make as well, through the basis here. But the problem with scholarship this particular person was discussing is that they need every single interpretation scholarship or article or book that argues a particular interpretation of a thinker is they're trying to argue the official interpretation of a thinker. And their problem with this way of thinking is that you're just going to end up arguing of like, what is the official way to view this thinker? Whereas if you're just willing to accept that you are extrapolating, you're doing your own thing with the ideas that you believe that this thinker has come up with, then you're able to actually expand the knowledge of the field rather than just arguing what they said. You're being like, well, maybe I had a misreading here and here, but that misreading actually led me to this cooler concept in the process. Even though I can't claim that I got that from Hegel or Marx anymore, I can't claim that Hegel or Marx had that idea. I can claim that my misunderstanding about that actually brought about a greater understanding of what I want philosophy to be. It helped me reflect upon myself, and that's my problem with that's my and not necessarily their problem, the poster's problem, but my thing is like I've had misreadings, I've had like misremembering of like songs or something that have ended up like being leading me down a thought process that was something worth having. It's not the fact that I got it wrong, but the fact that it could have been useful. It could have had a function in me either reading this wrong or me only taking about half of what the thinker was thinking and just rejecting the other half, stuff like that. It's not about having the proper original interpretation that the thinker was having when they wrote the book, but rather like they're coming up with all these concepts. How can I use these concepts? How can my particular understanding of these concepts work, etc. And if you want to soon, we can start working our way in a more proper fashion through the first chapter itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about that.
Any responses before we begin that, though?
Yeah, I wanted to, because like I mean that kind of reminded me of Deleuze's early monographs, because he wrote like five monographs on Hume, Nietzsche, Spinoza,
Leibniz.
Bergson, and
wasn't there one on Leibniz?
Kant.
Oh, Kant. Kant
Leibniz is later.
Leibniz is the second to last book, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, but like those five early monographs, basically, like I mean, the way I've come to view them is that like he's not doing this kind of like he's not making an accurate representation of the thinker. He's putting it to he's making use of them. It's a productive reading rather than a truly faithful reading.
Yeah, the eternal return causes it's the chaos of the future. It's accepting the chaos of the future rather than living the same life over and over again. And everybody is like, you French people don't understand. It's like, well, it's a book on it's the Nietzsche and philosophy is really a book on Deleuze, if we're gonna be a little bit honest.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wanted to, if anything, when going through the 6 chapters of this section, I do kind of want to fill in the holes that I felt were left by the last reading group, if anything. Particularly, I want to start with the first chapter, kind of outlining what a machine is, because I felt by the end of the last reading group that more than anything, we had assumed that it was kind of just a definition everybody understood more than anything.
Yeah. Yeah, because like I mean, especially since they later make a kind of a distinction between mechanism and they talk about the distinction between mechanism and vitalism, which are kind of like two views on like biology and materialism. How does biology work? Is it just matter and motion? Is it just matter and motion, or is it like is there some kind of like life energy there? And basically like what I got from that was that like they're not talking about machines in terms of this base function. They're talking about in this kind of like base in the sense of like no, not base, lifeless. This like lifeless just like one-to-one direct logic. It's a very logical, mechanistic view of matter. Like they're not thinking about machine in that way. For them, machines are defined by this active functioning. And I think what helped me understand it is kind of comparing the concept of machine as they use it to kind of the traditional view of organs. because like an organ, especially for them, it's like it's this rather strict view. It's this rather strict thing which has a function. It is doing something, and it is a part of this greater body. Basically, the body is viewed as this kind of like closed, effectively designed system where it's like the body is doing what it does, and it does that almost naturally. Whereas a machines can be turned off and on, they can be plugged into other things. You can take apart a machine, build it back up. And especially with just the importance of deterritorialization, of breaking down and of disconnecting. Like, I think that is a better way of viewing machine not as like this, machine not in this kind of like sense of like dead, like kind of like dead matter, but in the sense of like basically something technical. They talk about technical objects in the Marxist sense. Actually, wait, no, I'm not gonna. I think I need to reread that part before talking about that more.
I don't know how far you've read in, I guess, the Deleuze and Guattari pairing itself, but I can't remember if glitching is their concept or a Baudrillardian concept. I can't remember if it's either of theirs, honestly. But that's
That
kind of
sounds that sounds more something more in the digital realm.
yeah,
So
Baudrillard-ish.
probably Baudrillard.
Yeah, kind of. I the problem with me is I'm like I have read some Baudrillard or have somewhat of an interpretation through what I've read, even though I've read much more Deleuze and Guattari than I have Baudrillard. Um, like I'm kind of bringing in into understanding concepts like deterritorialization and reterritorialization. Specifically, the book he wrote, I guess, kind of in response to this. What is it? Symbolic Exchange of Death. I don't know if you've heard of that one before.
Yeah, I know about that one. Haven't read it though.
It's not an easy book to get your hands on, but it's like $40. And I've never seen it in person other than the one I bought online. But kind of it would be interesting to understand like machines deterritorialization and I guess the idea of like a glitch in the system, kind of a glitch in the flow. Like what happens when the flow between machines like breaks. Because I guess they're kind of talking about it in a purely productive sense, but or in a I guess the flow sense. But what happens when the flow of the machine breaks? Like the machines themselves make up, I guess using Lacanian terminology, the symbolic structures as well as the imaginary structures. But could there not also be something of the real, this outside world that doesn't fit into the machines that just causes, I guess, a rupture in the flow? Just the machines aren't working together as an assemblage anymore because of this like glitch in the system. I feel like I'm kind of rambling at this point.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that would. I think that's like I think that for Deleuze and Guattari, it's not really a thing, because like the breaking off is how machines work. That's how it, and this breaking off, this breaking down, that's how it works. And so, and I guess a glitch, at least in the way that you explained it, seems like something of interest only if there is kind of this implicit proper functioning, this proper way. There's like a proper flow or process that is interrupted or broken. Whereas
I don't know if proper is the right word because it does kind of assume like a being metaphysics in the process, which we've kind of already thrown out. But kind of like there is a flow and it is being interrupted. And so something new either has to form or like it's all going to fall apart.
you're talking about glitch there, right? Glitch.
Yeah. I guess on that because I don't want it to get a sense in like we're still forming like the human mind as something that has to function in a certain way, but the a glitch is rather something that in the process of it functioning in any way stops, I guess, one of those processes from flowing in the way that it has been. If we're I'm trying to avoid, I guess, philosophically problematic terms in Deleuze and Guattari's terminology, I guess.
Yeah. So for me, what helped me understand what they were talking about with machine was as an example they gave later on. I'm trying to find it. I remember it distinctly because it's kind of nauseating. It's the example of the baby vomiting, um, where it's just like, and it's around that part where they're like talking about, I think they talk about sphincters as well, but it's basically just like the point is the functioning of a machine, insofar as it is doing what it does, it is this breaking off, letting flow. You have a flow, and the machine is the breaking off of that. Like
It's the direction of the flow in a way.
yeah, it's the direction, it's the rhythm of the flow, it's the how the flow flows.
This might be a problematic example because of like it's 2023 at this point, but would the Hogwarts stairs kind of function as this? You know, the I guess
The flow is the students,
yeah,
the
and
body
the stairs move
Hogwarts is
around.
the body with the organs,
I don't
and
know if that would be good for like conceptually thinking about it, but they're like the stairs are like moving around and they're like they're there to match the flows, but also the existence of stairs in particular places mean that students can and can't go in certain places that they make.
maybe,
I
but I
don't
think
know. I mean, I'm not claiming what's her name thought of
oh no,
or he who
she isn't a Deleuze and Guattarian.
who
She isn't a Deleuze and
she
Guattarian.
who should not be named. Um, I don't think she was a Deleuze or Guattarian, but I think by accident she may have made a good example of what machines do to flows.
I think with the Hogwarts stairs, they're a little bit too random. It's a bit too unpredictable. Whereas a machine always has there's a level. It's always doing something, and you can you can point at a function and be just like, okay, that's why it's the explanation of what it's doing. Whereas the stairs are kind of just like moving, and we don't get an explanation of like what it's doing. They're just moving for the I guess they're just moving for the fun of it or something like that. I guess like that's kind of the limit of the example, but like, yeah, to kind of like blow it up to a level where people are the flows. Actually, no, traffic lights.
Yeah, that's kind of
Traffic
what I
lights.
was about to think. I was thinking on the other end, the traffic or what are they
Yeah.
called? The walking signs. That's what I was thinking of.
Crosswalks.
Yeah,
Actually, both of them. You got multiple flows crossing each other, and
yeah.
the machine is regulating each flows. This kind of like regular this regular rhythmic cutting off of one flow, letting flow of another flow. That's like yeah, yeah. In the same way that like actually I don't think capillaries do
City
that.
planning was I think philosophized this, which was one of I believe it was my second introduction to Deleuze after Mark Fisher was philosophizes this their 6-part series on Deleuze. And one of the things I believe that the host was talking about was like city planning in the 60s and 70s with like a Deleuzian framework being able to go back and critique it because I think if you haven't read it yet, maybe micropolitics and segmentation would also kind of be good with this. But I think that section focuses a little bit too much on micropolitics to be useful to like the example of flows. But the particular problem brought up with the thinking of the those old city planners was that they tried to segment everything by use in that the housing was in one area, the work was in one area, the entertainment was in one area, the nightlife was in one area, if that's separate from entertainment. Just thing after thing, every part of life was in a different area. Different types of shopping might be in a different area. And that caused, they didn't think of it beforehand because, I mean, it's kind of obvious afterwards in hindsight when you have, what is it?
Yeah.
Monday night hindsight or Monday morning hindsight or whatever they call it for football. But like the problem with this style of city planning is that each different segment of the city would fall dead when another segment was in use. So you'd be in the residential for what, from I don't know, 6 p.m. to 8 in the morning. Then you go to work. Then you go to entertainment. And during all those, if we're just going to accept 3 segments, I guess to keep it simple, each of the other 2 was pretty much empty. This means that home robberies are going to become a lot easier because literally nobody in the neighborhood is there. Everybody's at work or the children are at school. The work areas that now fill the downtowns, the office spaces, are dead after 6 o'clock because everybody's gone home or gone away to where the actual entertainment is now. And it's just kind of, it's the fact that they forgot how flows function, and that they just kind of put all the regulatory machines of the flows in between these huge, I guess, oceans. They just put up big walls of where the flows move in at one time and then just boop and then boop and then boop. And there's not this constant flow. There's not this thing where people are intermingling between the residential, between the office space, between the entertainment, and being able to exist in somewhat of all 3 spaces at the same time, but that the flow has been segmented at such a highly general level that certain areas are just left nearly empty. I don't exactly know how well of an example that is. I think
that is a really good example. Basically, like in this at least based on what you described, basically like the different like the different areas, they all have their own functions, like entertainment, like the kind of like bifurcation of entertainment and nightlife. Like it's basically kind of like separating out functions. It's basically kind of pushing the flows in it's regulating the flows in this kind of determinate way. But it's not, you said that it wasn't planned, but it's only something that you could see in hindsight, right?
Well, the cities themselves are planned, obviously, but
Yeah.
the problems themselves, the increase in burglaries of the homes while they're empty,
Okay.
the death of downtowns, all of these were side effects that should have been seen, but kind of weren't because it was just kind of not the mindset of the planners in the process. But it does end up being, I guess, the way you could look about this is the flow of the machine, how the machine is segmented by the different regulatory machines, whether that be like how society blocks off time. That might be a machine in itself. I don't know if that's if you can claim time or societal time as a machine or not. I might be claiming way too much here.
I think I think we can, at least for now, we can bracket that away as a kind of a effective machine, or a phenomenon.
It is segmenting how we
processing of a machine.
It's segmenting how we distribute our time.
Yeah, I mean the clock. I mean the clock is a machine in the sense that it is informing the kind of the breaking of flows. It's like it's 6 o'clock, time to go to the bar. I don't drink. I don't know if people go to the bars at 6. It's probably like 3 in the morning or so.
It matters. I've been to a bar at 5. I think one of my classes, my professors had after his class that ended at 5, we'd go to the bar at like 6 or 5:30, one or the other. But I mean, we were pretty close to the downtown. That's why. But what I think is pretty interesting about what a city planning example can bring, even though it's one of my special interests. So I'm kind of partial towards examples like this, but it is very interesting kind of how flows can affect the machines themselves, or how the interaction between machines and flows kind of creates a progress throughout time. Because eventually, if we're going to look at it historically, the flow of the only having like office spaces downtown in these middle-sized cities, which isn't like where, I don't want to claim most people live there, but a lot of people do, and that's kind of what the cities that transition during the 50s through the 70s in this particular style kind of are. But the problem with a lot of them is that only office space eventually occupied downtown. They didn't have the entertainment had moved out to the suburbs where the people were going home to. But because of that, those areas become, I guess, more degraded in a sense. And the office finally moves out, and then the downtown in a lot of these places is either near dying, starting to be revitalized, mattering on what path these different towns are going on. But the flow has completely changed. Where by the time we get into the 2010s, the office spaces also moved to the suburbs. So the flows, the interactions between the flows and the machines over time, the 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 way that they interact with each other is slowly changed. Like, think of a riverbed in a way. You know how the river flows itself and slowly corrodes the sand to the point where it bends out and then changes its shape over time. The flow of the machines is changing the machines themselves and also changing the flow, because people might move out of the city because they're like, this downtown sucks. I want to move over to Myrtle Beach or something. I don't know. I was the first city that popped up in my mind, sadly. But just kind of, I don't know if that's a good way to put it. I don't know if that's something they really explore here, the history of machines or the time in machines. If that's a book they talk about here, or not a book, that's an idea they talk about here, or they talk about in A Thousand Plateaus. What would be your response to that, if this isn't just some like insane schizophrenic rant?
I think that you are right, and I think that they're kind of. I think the reason that they don't go into this, at least this early in the book, they don't go into kind of the more specific history, is because they're kind of laying this more abstract groundwork, in a sense where it's just like, okay, what is the conditions of that history? How is it, like, how can, like, okay, basically, like, okay, we have history, we have all these phenomena. What is going on in the background, full background, on this like much higher level of abstraction, where you don't really have the particular events, but you have instead kind of the conditions for those particular events. And so in that sense, like what you're talking about is really a good example. Actually, what I thought you were going to talk about was how, like, basically city planning has all these different levels, where, like, you have, on the one hand, you have like this more individual personal level where it's like different people going to different places. You have like one business, you can understand it and its functionings, and then pull back a little bit, an entire neighborhood, pull back an entire city, and then you can even pull back a little bit more and see, okay, that city is one city in a much wider area, especially now, because it basically this global connections. And so, like, talking about city planning, you can talk about like 5 levels at once.
Yeah,
that's what I thought you were gonna say. You went in a
no,
different
I was trying to give a time aspect to it, is the thing.
Oh yeah. I mean the historical part.
I mean, that kind of has to go with what I was talking about earlier, with like me being a different person. Like, I don't know how long ago that was, like 50 minutes ago. But it's just kind of like, I'm constantly, my machines, like they talk about like the organs being replaced, but like how much do the organ machines, the desiring machines that build me up, affect which new desiring machines I take on, etc. Especially if I'm not like how much does desiring machine in place 1 affect how I replace desiring machine in place 7 or whatever. If you want to like if you want to segment the body with organs, I don't know if that's something you can actually do. If you just want to put in a grid pattern.
I think segmenting it would turn it into a body with organs.
Yeah, I mean, yes, if you I guess that is kind of it. They don't really talk about the body with organs very much, even though, or at least explicitly, they don't find the term explicitly, but they're talking about the body with the organs and the organs at the same time.
Yeah.
I mean, is there anything else you wanted to talk about in one? I mean, we've kind of avoided a clear definition of machines. We've gotten a few in there. But I mean, it's kind of sometimes sidetracking is the best way to go. It's more interesting a lot of the times.
Yeah,
is there anything else in this first chapter you wanted to go over before we get to the body without organs?
the first
Um,
section. I don't think so. I think for me, the difficulty with something like the designing machines is that it's always gonna, that term is always gonna keep coming up. It's, or like when it, even when it's not being mentioned, it's in the background. And so like I think trying to give it like this like dictionary definition, or like this clear definition when we're only on the first chapter, I think that'd be a bit presumptuous. But I did want to ask you, I
yeah,
did want to ask you something that kind of bridges into the second section, the body without organs, but like this concept of anti-production.
it is kind of hard. It is from Bataille. I know that at the very least. I know um, they're getting anti-production, at least from Bataille, if not from one of the people that inspires Bataille in the Accursed Chair Volume 1. Um, it's kind of, if you view, do you know the base and superstructure in Marx?
Roughly.
Kind of backwards in that the productive is on top of the unproductive here. Um, but whereas I guess I'm trying to make sure I don't overstep the definition, but the unproductive, I guess, is in a sense, for Marx at the very least, you need the police, you need the state in order to define the laws to get the workers to go to work or to stop striking or whatever. That's just for Marx, but it's these unproductive structures, these things that don't create capital, nor do they create money, but they create the possibility for capital and money to exist at all. For government in Marx, it is the threat of violence that constantly exists to step outside of the law, to destroy property, etc. For here, I think it is a little bit different because the body without organs for capitalism is such an abstract thing. We talked about it in the last reading group. It's capital that creates money, that creates capital. You probably heard that a million times when you were listening through that reading group.
Yeah.
But it is kind of because the idea that capital creates money and money creates capital forms capitalism, but it doesn't do anything productive. It just kind of, it is the code, or I don't know if it's necessarily the code that, because I think code in their use is productive, even if it's not language wise. If it, even though it doesn't always exist in language, with their example with the wasp and the orchid, which we mentioned a lot in the chat, I know, as a non-language system of code. I believe he talks a lot. Guattari talks a lot about non-language systems of code and the
Yeah.
Machinic Unconscious. I've heard, at least. I have not yet to read or own that book. But with the non-productive as the body without organs, it is kind of like, I guess, the grounds for the possibility of code, and that everything within the body must fit here, or else it's going to be thrown off in a way. It's not capitalism if it doesn't make money and then make capital. That's the best way I can do it. You need the rule, but the rule itself is not productive in itself.
In a sense, I guess, like, to kind of maybe summarize it a little bit, the anti-production and the body without, because they say that the full body without organs belongs to the realm of anti-production. And so basically, like, the body without organs and anti-production, they kind of like, they constrain the designing machines. The designing machines, they want to go, they want to deterritorialize all the way. Whereas the body without organs is just like, no, don't do that, bad. And then like they basically, they kind of like, they constrain it, they give it a specific form. At least that's how I'm thinking about it right now. I don't know. Thank you for the explanation of like the other uses of.
That's the only definition I can give for non-productive. But Bataille uses it slightly differently, in that he uses non-productive for like consumption instead. So there's the productive process and the consumption that allows for production to exist as well, but it's also part of the process. And I know Baudrillard in Symbolic Death and Exchange is kind of like, okay, consumption has capital has killed the process of consumption. Everything is production now. Um, the systems, the rituals that existed beforehand are no longer there. Capitalism is our Jesus, and we can never repay him, or whatever Baudrillard wants to claim. Um, and for Bataille, though, he's studying all these archaeological or anthropological, or he's doing an anthropological study of these different societies throughout time, ranging, I don't know how far back in history, a couple hundred years or so for certain societies, his modern age during the Cold War for others. But he finds them to be divided on this line between how much the societies are willing to consume and how much they're willing to produce. Like Tibetan monks are like full consumption. You might not think that, but in his dichotomy, it's between like production is this expansion while consumption is the increased possibility for expansion. The like you can't grow, or plants can't grow if they're not able to have food. And the having the food, the getting the food is a separate process from the growth itself. For Bataille, I don't know if that's an example Bataille uses, but it's kind of the way I conceptualized it when I was reading the Cursed Share Volume 1. But there's for the Tibetan monks, they're completely consuming because they're completely using all their possible resources to grow and to learn, or not to grow. I'm using terms way too differently, but they're like using all of their societal resources as consumption. They're just reading. They're not trying to expand their territory. They're not even trying to recruit new members. New members just kind of, if they want to be there, they just end up there. They're not defending themselves. They need other countries to do that, at least for Bataille. And on the other end, there's like completely productive societies, which I mean means that you don't enjoy much at all. Your society is almost clearly oriented towards domination and expansion. Those are the opposite ends. And most societies kind of end up in the middle, where production means that they expand and grow, but consumption also means that those societies are more fruitful and sustainable. If that's a good way to explain those concepts to you. I don't.
Yeah,
The problem is I don't know how either of those conceptions necessarily fit to the body without organs. I can explain both of them to you, but I cannot explain what the body without organs being non-productive means.
Yeah, I can okay, in that I can see where kind of like Deleuze and Guattari are differing from Baudrillard and Bataille, because I mean they expressly say that, like, because like for them, consumption, recording, production, it's all production. It's all a form of production. And it's the production of consumption, the production of recording, the production of production. And so like, yeah, I think you said at some point where it's just like the terms are kind of different. It's just like Bataille has his own way of doing it. That's not necessarily how it's doing here. The reason that I asked this question is because Will, one of the co-hosts of Acid Horizon,
Yeah,
on
emo
like
for
a Q&A a while ago, basically someone asked, oh, what's a concept that you didn't really understand or thought you understood but rethought? And then he was just basically just like, when I started reading Anti-Oedipus, I saw anti-production and I was like, oh, that's just like these repressive forces, right? But then kind of later on he started thinking that maybe that wasn't quite correct. And so I guess I was a bit suspicious of the term. Yeah.
I mean, it might be that my problem. I haven't really bridged the gap to understanding the anti-production that the body without organs is. I just know that the body without organs, as I kind of tried to define in the last reading group, it serves as the ground of the possibility for anything. Like it is the limit. Like it can't do anything on its own, but it also defines what can be done. is the best way I can explain it.
In that, so I think this might be an interesting place to bring in Kant, because
That's kind of, we brought in Kant last time as well.
because for him the transcendental, as I understand it, basically like the transcendental is both the conditions and the limits of knowledge, where basically like to have, because like for Kant, he accepts in a basic sense the empiricist's insistence on experience of the external world being the basis for knowledge. But then he kind of like points out that like, okay, to be able to see, you have to have eyes. To be able to hear, you have to have ears. To have experience, you need to have these kind of like these already existing conditions. And for him, that's what the transcendental is. And for him, he wants to have it be ahistorical, this non-historical thing. We just have those. We just have those those conditions.
And then
Whereas
Hegel's like, nobody, you can't do that. They're all historical. Everything is history.
Yeah, and I know that in their recent episode on Deleuze's book on Kant, Machine and Unconscious Happy Hour, has talked about how like this weird duality to these transcendental these conditions. I forget the exact term. That's why I'm using the term conditions. But like basically, they're simultaneously imminent in the sense that they're imminent to experience. They're of experience, but also not in experience. And it's like this. They're simultaneously imminent and transcendent. And so for Deleuze and Guattari, they're going to be very historicist about that. And that's where, and that's, I guess, like, that's where I would question your description of it as the limit and the condition, in that, because like the body without organs changes. The body without organs, it's not that like the body without organs itself changes, but like at one point we have body without organs, and then at some point that falls, so we lose that. It doesn't work anymore, and a new body without organs takes its place.
Yeah, you're getting at something I've kind of had a problem with my own understanding of Deleuze with, and I got to discuss it with the in-person meeting I had 4 days ago. But like I explained last time, my friend I'm doing this with in person in my hometown is they're coming at it through both a Jungian and kind of Heideggerian lens from the books that they have read, not claiming that they're 100% either of those. So I couldn't answer the question. I was like, okay, I know we can replace every single organ, but can we replace the body itself? Like, can we become completely new? And that's something that's been bugging me. It's like, well, I want to make a political project where that's possible, but it also has to be like, it has to be conceptually possible first, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, just completely what happens when the body with the organs, like the fundamental code, or the fundamental thing that determines all systems of code on top of it, and all flows, all machines on that are graphed onto it, just doesn't work anymore. Can I throw that away, or am I stuck with it? That's kind of the questioning I've been having, and it is kind of the limit with not having finished 1,000 plateaus that my understanding has reached at this moment.
Yeah, I think that's where, I guess, like in general, that's why an experimental politics is necessary, because it's just like basically trying to imagine this future. Like the problem is kind of like, do we not go far enough? Do we just kind of like replace all the organs, but just keep the body of capital, or
Yeah,
do we like kind of like get rid of capital, but the body of the organs that takes its place is something worse? Like, yeah, and in that sense, it's why this kind of forceful experimentation with a little bit of caution is necessary.
yeah.
I think that with the body without organs, I think there's an interesting way of thinking about it by starting with accelerationism, and then kind of in terms of like it's the way it views historical processes. And I'm talking about accelerationism broadly, not Nick Land, not
Yeah, I know, I
not
know.
not Madam
I've
or
read this
Nick.
entire book before, and I'm like, how can I read Nick Land out of accelerationism?
Oh, you read Mark Fisher.
Yeah, that I've
Yeah.
read all of his a lot of his major works. I can't claim I've read all of them.
Yeah, Terminator versus Avatar is the one that I know has it talks about accelerationism, but it's basically just like that's where basically just like the the body of the earth, body of the despot, those are the two other bodies without organs. We've Western society has gone through those.
Yeah,
Those have fallen away. We've developed.
well, they haven't completely fallen away. Isn't fascism kind of the return of the body of the despot?
Well, I don't know. There's a specifically capitalist flavor to fascism where it's like it's about like there's an aspect of it where it's like this emphasis on management, on like
Yeah, I mean, it is kind
fascism.
of incorporating the modes of government that kind of come in with the advent of liberalism that Foucault talks
Yeah,
about in the lecture of biopolitics. The importance of managing a population. It is kind of this weird synthesis of these two bodies. Like it feels like a Frankenstein body more than anything.
yeah.
If
It's
I'm
utilitarianism at its worst.
um I guess kind of. I know Foucault in
That is partially a
the
joke.
I'm not going to claim that I do, or I'm not going to claim the opposite of what you're claiming because
Okay.
I'm not a fan of utilitarianism. So I'm willing to put anything on them that makes them look worse. Um, I think it's a bad ethical theory, and I will I don't like thinking about it very often. Um,
Yeah.
because I'd rather view my time thinking about better ethical systems. But kind of it's this like like I was saying on it's this it feels like half the body of capital, the management that comes with the advent of liberalism, put onto the body without the body of the despot, just kind of like amalgamated together, and that you need this singular basis for society. It can't deterritorialize, but it's also everything has to be managed, and that follows into like in kind of a way they're the management of like racial populations because it's not
Yeah.
just the management of the national population anymore and you have to manage this I guess slightly more abstract thing to
Yeah.
maintain control.
One of the things that I'm really interested in is like once I'm more familiar once I've finished this book and then once I've read the history of sexuality and
That's a
Foucault's
good one.
idea. Yeah.
I'd love to do another reading group on that, especially since I've finished the first half of it.
Yeah, I read a little bit of the read a little bit of the introduction recently and it was just so
Yeah,
interesting. But like basically just like looking at kind of like the metaphysics that they set for that D&G set forward in Anti-Oedipus,
yeah,
like thinking that alongside biopolitics in general. And it's like especially with the discussion of repression in this first chapter, because they do talk about repression. They're probably going to talk about it more extensively later on, but every time I
yeah.
saw repression, I thought it was very interesting because like I think specifically one of the terms they use, one of the phrases they use is like primary repression or primordial repression, where and so like think about that and then looking at Foucault, who was very critical of the idea of repression, where it's just like everyone's talking about repression, everyone's talking about how this is repressed, but the fact that everyone's talking about it shows that repression isn't really the problem. That's a gross reduction,
It's oppression, not
repression.
it's oppression, not repression, is kind of Foucault's claim.
I'm talking, yeah, that's his general claim about power, but like specifically with regards to sexuality,
Yeah,
discourse
yeah,
of sexuality, that he's talking about repression.
yeah. The
He's
the
talking
chapter
about
on the
yeah,
repressive hypothesis.
yeah, and so basically, and because like you can see a little bit of the repressive hypothesis, or at least I see a little bit of the repressive hypothesis at work in Anti-Oedipus. I'm like, I guess like one of my long-term goals is to be able to kind of like try and see what happens if you kind of suspend that concept of repression or recast it using Foucault's critique. I don't know how
I
to
think
even begin with that, so I'm going to leave that for future me.
it might just be because I read him. I'm reading him in the process right now, but Wilhelm Reich's book on the mass psychology of fascism, which is one of the psychologists Guattari and Deleuze bring up in section 4 here. I'm reading the book they quote right now because I was able to find it for fairly cheap. And it kind of does seem like his psychology could be a good bridge between these two concepts here, as well as the desire being produced. Because Reich specifically talks about the weirdness of sexuality, how the I guess the weird sexual repression of the lower middle class authoritarian family leads towards I guess libidinal energy being set towards these more reactionary modes of thought. And their idea of desire being produced means that desire can't be repressed unless it is first produced. What these societies are doing rather is limiting what desires can be produced. That it is oppression because it is destruction. The destruction of the possibility of being one of the, I guess, marginalized group, whether that be homosexuality, a woman who has her own thoughts, etc. Because I mean, it is the Victorian age he's talking about in the first, the repressive hypothesis chapter at the very least. I don't know if that's a good, clear answer to what you're talking about, what you were asking, but that's kind of in the middle because, I feel like I'm trying to get there at the very least, in that the sexual norms of the Victorian era is producing the sexuality of the Victorian era. It's not repressing some natural sexuality. It's the desire is produced in the norms themselves.
Yeah, it's producing a particular kind of sexuality, or like, yeah, it's producing a particular kind of sexuality and then within that kind of structure, certain manifestations are being repressed, certain manifestations are being intensified.
Yeah, because
that's interesting. That is interesting. I don't know if I can say more on that.
I mean, let's try to get through the rest of this chapter before we reach 2 hours, because we got we're about an hour 20 in right now. Is there anything you wanted to say? I think we got to it a lot before we started going through the chapters. But chapter 3, I think, talks a lot, or section 3 talks a lot about the subject, how it's produced, and like the subject being on the periphery, the Kantian aspects of this theory, etc. Or that's just kind of what I'm reading. The Kantian theory, according to intensive qualities, fill up to varying degrees. Matter that has no empty spaces is profoundly schizoid. There's just the random stuff I'm seeing here. We talked a lot about what does it mean for intensity to be 0 in the last reading group. I think we did spend a good bit of time on this chapter. Were there any questions you had concerning when you either read this or when you were listening to that section?
I don't think so. I don't think I had any particular questions about this. I did want to share that, like, the way I ended up, I guess, like, visualizing the subject in this was basically like the weird, nasty stuff that like forms on the edge of drains, because it is this like, it's this kind of excess or remainder that like is left over when the process is already gone through.
Yeah,
I just thought that was I guess like a.
I just think that the edge of a sphere, or however you're supposed to pronounce that.
The edge of a sphere.
Yeah, or no. The example I used last time, it's kind of this, but Jupiter. I think I used the Jupiter example last time, where you get to see the outside of the Jupiter. You get to see all the winds on top, but you don't get to see all the forces on the bottom that create it.
Did you say horses or forces?
Forces. Yeah, I don't think there's any horses on Jupiter quite yet. We might get there one day.
I was a bit confused there. Yeah, I'm not sure, because the name of the section is the subject and enjoyment. I don't, and like we talked about the subject, I don't know about enjoyment. but I don't have enough ideas about it to have any question. I guess like for me it's a note, it's kind of just like a note to go back and reread this before continuing on to the next chapter. But like I think we can actually move on to the
Yeah, the four chapters, we spent a lot of time on there, particularly because discussing fascism has been something that I've been trying to explain for like 5 years, ever since I became a leftist. Really, it was like one of the things is like, how the hell do people think this?
yeah.
And it's just kind of working my way back, and it's like, oh, it's not rational, but also it is rational because rationality is the product of desire.
Yeah.
But this is probably, I think this is the longest chapter in the section. So any questions, any comments before we get into, I'm trying not to repeat what we discussed last time, just for the sake of
Yeah.
brevity.
I also think that we already talked well, bits of it earlier, especially with the recent, like you bring up Willem Reich, and then before that with how like kind of the Guattari's general problems with the conduct of psychoanalysis. I think we talked about that. The whole, in a sense, kind of the analyst knowing the proper way to do things, where it's just like, okay, I have this, I know how people are supposed to work. This person is kind of failing that, so let's just kind of let's steer them, into the Oedipus triangle.
Yeah, a lot of I know they don't talk about this, but we talked about it in my history class on what is it, critical and cultural theory, this last semester that I got to take. Amazing class, but I don't know how many universities are actually offering it. But kind of a lot of the things within the people who are still in the Freudian tradition post Freud is that other than Lacan, pretty much up to what, the 70s or so, the majority of their goals is to strengthen the ego. Maybe Reich is an exception as well, but like for Melanie Klein, which is a huge part of what they talk about in the final section of this chapter, section 6, um, her main goal is kind of both the strengthening of the ego and the terminology they use, the affirmation of Oedipus within the conscious or
Yeah.
within the subject. Um, yeah, those are kind of the two goals, and they're kind of somewhat synonymous in a way, and that you got to be Oedipalized to truly have a strength the ego or whatever. It might be different approaching whether we're talking about R.D. Laing or Melanie Klein or Anna Freud, etc. But overall, I did want to mention that in contrast to a lot of the people that are positively inspiring Guattari and Deleuze, rather than the people that they're um, criticizing, a lot of the people that they positively take from are not the biggest fans of the ego. In contrast,
Yeah.
they think that either it's not the primary thing that we should be studying. I think Lacan thinks the symbolic unconscious is probably the primary thing. For Reich, it might be different. It might be desire as a whole, or the desire at the heart of everything. But for them, they're kind of, it's a very irrationalist psychiatry, if anything. On the other end,
Rationalist or irrationalist?
irrationalist psychiatry.
Okay.
And desire is the first step. They're not trying to get back to this lost phenotype of what we should be, rather that they're trying to understand where we're at and how we got there.
Yeah, I actually I heard. I think I heard this from Machine Unconscious Happy Hour, but like I believe Melanie Klein actually suggested that we understand schizophrenia not as the failure of Oedipus, but as pre-Oedipal. And so like I don't think that's something they talk about, but like
They don't talk about Klein doing that. They talk about trying to be anedible without Oedipus.
yeah, yeah, but like you already have that kind of like that rethinking of the relation of the schizophrenic to Oedipus in Melanie Klein.
Yeah, yeah.
That's like I guess like to kind of like step back a little bit for Deleuze, this is kind of an example. This would be an example of him finding minor figures in the history of psychoanalysis. Basically, like analysts who don't really, who are kind of like at odds with the dominant paradigm of psychoanalysis. In the same way that like he goes through the history of philosophy, finds people like Nietzsche, a certain reading of Hume, people like Leibniz, and then kind of like taking these minor figures and then like doing stuff with them. I don't know, just a little fun thing, I guess.
Yeah. But I guess getting back to the fourth chapter specifically with the psychiatry, this and the third chapter is kind of where they develop what does it mean for desire to be produced.
Yeah.
Because I mean, for them, everything or desiring production and social production are the same thing, or the same process, if not the same thing, as I understand it.
The production in the same sense.
They're produced at about
Yeah.
the same time or within the same process. I don't know if that's the proper interpretation exactly, but it's the kind of what I got out of it.
Yeah, they're produced alongside each other. And it's not that like one is produced then the other. It's because like they're pretty clear that it's just like, okay, it looks like you have this one thing that is produced and this other thing. That's not how it is. It's all happening at once.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
all happening
And then we had our conversation how Deleuze and Guattari are against the idea of lack being primary. And for people who have not read or people who have not seen or haven't read this or seen the first reading group, what it means for lack to be primary is the lack of something is what creates the desire. That's kind of the argument that they're rejecting. What they want to assert instead is that desire is produced through a number of mechanisms. I don't exactly understand how desire is always produced, like in every single circumstance. Is it like the relation of the organs to the body without organs? Would you know, Sam?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
Like how desire is produced. That's kind of one thing I always feel like I'm getting close to, but missing. If you can't answer, it's fine. I mean, if I don't have an answer for it, there's no reason for you not to either.
I'll need to go back and look at this again, but the way I thought about it throughout reading this was that like it's not that like desire is produced, it's that desire is productive. But like I guess I need to rethink that. I don't know.
I mean, I've always desiring production. I mean, there's I guess there's two ways to view that. In that, I mean, I was always looking at it as like the desires have to come from somewhere. They have to come externally, empirically, or just thinking about it empirically, particularly in their framework, because Freud and others want to assert this more rationalistic framework where the lacks or desires are already there, and that's why the lack is primary. But for them, the desire is produced, and that the intensity, the trying to get back down to zero, is the lack itself. The hungry is produced, or the state of hunger is produced, or the desire to eat might be a production of that. And then the lack of food is the result of the production of the desire for food. That's the way I've always tried to conceive it, and that might be a little bit I guess reductive.
Yeah, I mean, like, I guess like one of the things is that like it's not that lack doesn't exist; it's that lack has to be produced in the same way that like Deleuze, when talking about metaphysics, it's not that lack, it's not that negativity doesn't exist. It's that like you have this positive ontology which produces negativity as an epiphenomenon. It's like this, it's kind of like the secondary view of things. Like basically I think he just, in different repetition, he describes negation in the Hegelian sense as negation as difference, because he's trying to rethink difference in different repetition, among other things. But like basically like difference as negative, as not a logical formulation, not a. basically to him, that is difference kind of like looked at from the bottom up. It's difference upside down. So it's basically just like, I think here here they're doing something similar where it's just like lack. There is something before there's this production that happens before the lack, that produces the lack, and therefore the phenomena of desire being produced by lack. I don't know if that makes sense. I don't know if that's coherent.
Yeah. I'm still a little lost on how desires are produced. Like, how do we come to have particular desiring machines? I felt every time I read through this, or like a source that they draw upon, I get a little bit closer to it, but it is always like, I think the problem with me trying to get there, and maybe with other people trying to understand how desire comes about in a Deleuzian framework, is the problem how expansive the production of desire is. Like, there's probably a million different ways that the desiring machines can join the assemblage that is me, or anybody else, really. So it is kind of,
Yeah,
it might just be to the point, there's just so many ways that it can come about, so many that are just so many, just schematically different, that it would just double the book size to try and talk about how they would come about, rather than just talking about how they work. And it is kind of, we discussed it last time, or no, we discussed it after last time, and one of the people that asked what is a body without organs, and they were trying to get like a more analytic philosophy type of definition on like what is it, and that, and we kind of got to discussing in the chat, I don't know if you were there or not, where it's just like, asking what it is not the right question, because it's not a categorical pure definition. It's kind of moving around a little bit, but you can understand it pretty much only through how it functions, in the way that it exists with other things in relation to them, and that's about the closest you can get.
Yeah, I think I actually said that in the Discord chat, or at least something similar to that. I'd like, I know
You
I
claim
had
it.
I know I posted like a long answer to that.
I think that is the best way to understand anything with Deleuze and Guattari here, is that they're not looking for what is. I mean, that would completely destroy the metaphysics of becoming that they're trying to establish here, but rather, like, everything functions in a certain way. Everything is in relation to other things, and that relation might be changing, may or may not. But to understand what it is, to try to pin it on a single definition in their framework, seems always to be a little bit reductive. I mean, the body without organs changes definitions within this book alone. Even forgetting 1,000 plateaus, there's probably 2 or 3 definitions for the body without organs in this book alone, but every single one is going to be a functional definition rather than a categorical one. It's how the body without organs functions in relation to these other concepts.
And I mean, that goes kind of as a word, the cherry on top of that like Deleuze and Guattari didn't agree on what body without organs was. They didn't agree on this, on the what exactly it meant, because they were like kind of looking through their own writing, and then they found maybe some inconsistencies, and then just asked each other, hey, what is the body without organs? And then they ended up with different views of it. But like even when you don't quite agree on what it does, you can still use it. You can still kind of like develop.
It's still in your toolkit.
Because like we know we can get from this chapter like some descriptors. Like, here are the things that it does. Here are examples of bodies without organs in society. Here are some of the problems that arise when like you become a body without organs, and like that in like going back to the kind of the ethical practical upshot of Gilles and Guattari, you don't need what is X. You don't need the answer to that in order to be able to do something with a concept. You just need to know, how can I use it? where does it come from? What can it do? That makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah. That does make sense. It's just kind of, I mean, if you understand what it can do, I mean, that's as close to proper understanding as you really need, in my view.
Yeah. Doesn't matter if it's the full understanding. It works.
Yeah. I kind of in this section, I don't know if you're ready quite to move on, but
Which section?
section 4 still,
Yeah.
page 29 for this. I want to skip the section on Wilhelm Reich and fascism just because I do think we got a good amount of that in the last reading group, and
Yeah.
I would tell anybody anybody that wants to hear about the section, the why do men fight for their servitude as stubbornly as though it was their salvation section, to please listen to the last one. I felt like we had a really productive conversation on that one.
Yeah.
But kind of if I'm going to go with the theme of filling in the holes, I did kind of want to talk more about their critique of Reich, if you're willing to do something like that. In
Yeah,
that
sure.
they talk about the problem with Reich's book is that he goes back to the dichotomy that he initially seems to have destroyed, because he keeps talking about in the mass psychology of fascism, trying to find its irrational core to explain everything. And their problem with it is that there's still within it, there's an assumption that the rational is existing on the opposite, and that psychoanalysis can only deal with the irrational. What they want to claim, that I think it seems to be a twofold claim at the bottom of 29, the Penguin edition, in that they're abolishing the distinction between the rational and the desire, that exists within us, but also rationality in itself is a production of desire. It is a
Yeah.
it's in there with social production and desiring production. um I wanted to know if you had any thoughts on that, because I know you have listened to that section before. I kind of my I guess the concept I got out of it was that rationality almost seems like a desire for reality in itself, the will towards truth or something.
Rationality.
Yeah, rationality ends up
Mhm.
being this desire for reality to exist in the singular way and being able to conceptualize everything within a singular framework. So you're rationalizing and justifying it through this conceptual worldview, is kind of what I'm getting out of this, or my implications from this concept.
I mean, what I'm getting out of it, I think like we might be, actually think we can kind of analogically, if not directly, link this to the kind of like the discussion of lack, because it's just like, okay, if desire comes from lacking something, then how does that idea of lack come to be in the first place? And so like that has to be produced. The value of it as a thing needs to be determined before the value of us seemingly not having it is then produced. Where it's just like the lack of something presupposes a value of something, the lack of which is then kind of is then like kind of like made possible. Although I guess like that kind of runs into other problems with some of the other things. But I think with the kind of leave that behind, the part about Reich reintroducing the divide between the rational and irrational, this kind of like this basically accepting this binary view of the thing. Like this is, I guess, another operative concept in a lot of Deleuze's work is Foucault and the History of Madness, which they reference in the last paragraph of the chapter of section 6, where it's like basically they're talking about how like we're basically the kind of like the definition of madness and rationality that's questioned through Foucault's historical well his genealogical um critique. Actually, wait, no. Sorry, I went off in the wrong direction. I said Foucault when I was actually thinking of Deleuze's image of thought, because one of the things that he brings up is that he takes it from Nietzsche. Rationality is a moral view, where it's like rationality, irrationality. It's this divide and organization of the kind of like proper thought, good thinking, and the kind of like the bad, the errant, the thought that doesn't fit. It's improper thought. And like even in like kind of like modern analytic philosophy, it's just kind of taken as a given that it's not as a given, but it's kind of like just an obvious neutral standard with no normative presumptions.
Yeah. I
And so,
absolutely hate it.
yeah, and I mean, as someone currently stuck in an analytic BA program, it is kind of frustrating.
Let's go pluralism.
Yeah,
Slightly
but like,
better.
yeah, it's well, it's you're not stuck with one way of doing things. So like, yeah, but like basically the with with Reich, he kind of moves away from this divide between kind of like real thought and then mistake. Because what he rejects is that like it's not some it's not some fluke that fascism happened. It
Yeah.
happened it happened because people wanted it to happen. People wanted some like people wanted something to fix their problems. They had some nasty views on people, like their neighbor. They look at them and just like, oh, that person's an immigrant. I don't know whether I can trust them. And then you have this politician who's talking about, hey, let's clean things up. And then it's just like there is this active production of fascism that happens based on within certain conditions in Western society. And it's just like treating that as a fluke is just false. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, that's one of Reich's best points is that
Yeah.
it's not a fluke. It's something.
Yeah.
These people aren't tricked. They wanted it, but the problem and the critique they have, and I imagine you were going to get this if I didn't interrupt you. Sorry.
Can I get
Is
to it?
the critique they have is that Reich still kind of treats it as a fluke of the mind in a way. Like
Yeah.
the problem was before before they wanted it, something went wrong, and Deleuze is like, wow, we want to lead away from fascism, but in order to do that, we can't treat it as there's a proper and improper structure of the mind.
Yeah.
Rather, we have to understand how structures of the mind form before we can even moralize about them. And we've
Yeah.
been moralizing about them for so long that we forgot to understand metastructure the entire time.
They just basically like Reich exchanges one paradigm of proper
Yeah,
proper and improper for another more implicit, less uh less obvious
it's slightly more
less obvious
historical,
than
proper and improper. It's closer, but it still makes it still has a problem by still trying to assert rationality as its own thing that exists outside
yeah.
of a system trying to justify itself.
Yeah, and that's kind of that's one of the things that they bring in Foucault for to have this general critique of the kind of the psychoanalytic program as what's the line? Give me a second.
The last paragraph of the entire book,
Well,
or not the entire book, the entire first chapter.
yeah, basically that psychoanalysis is completing the task begun by 19th century psychology.
Yeah. I don't
Basically,
remember
like
that where that is, but I remember reading that on my first reading.
page 50.
Page
Um,
50. Oh,
it's italicized. Can't miss
oh,
it.
on the contrary, what? Where is it?
On the
Insofar as
contrary,
psychoanalysis cloaks insanity in the mantle of a parental complex and regards the pattern of self punishment resulting from Oedipus as a confession of guilt, its theories are not at all radical or innovative. On the contrary, it is completing the task begun by 19th century psychology, namely to develop a moralized familial discourse of mental pathology, linking madness to the the half real, half imaginary dialectic of the family, deciphering within it the unending attempt to murder the father, the dull thud of the instincts hammering at the solidity of the family as an institution and at its most archaic symbols. Hence, instead of participating in an undertaking that will bring about genuine liberation, psychoanalysis is taking part in the work of bourgeois repression at its most far reaching level. That is to say, keeping European humanity harnessed to the yoke of daddy mommy and making no effort to do away with this problem once and for all. In chapter.
Yeah.
Sorry for just reading the whole thing.
Oh no,
it's a good section.
Yeah, it's a banger paragraph. I'm like, I get to kind of like situate it in the.
They have some banger paragraphs. I felt like they were just going off when I got to read the section on Reich the other day.
Yeah, but the I guess the implication there is that like you can't just, especially if you're trying to go for kind of a leftist, more revolutionary project, which is ultimately what kind of a Marxism wants to be. You can't be kind to Freud. He's a very bourgeois old man, and you need to treat him like that. And basically, you need to be a little bit more brutal with his theory than certain other Freudo-Marxists want to be. Because like
Marx, or not Marx, Marcuse.
Marcuse, yeah, I haven't read Marcuse, but I've gotten some of his ideas from like interviews, from people talking about him, and from what I understand, he seems like the general vibe is that he seems to be kind of like he's trying to marry Marx and Freud rather than slamming them together at infinite speed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've read through what is it, about half of Eros' Civilization now. A lot of it I feel like too much relies on kind of providing a real history to Freud than anything. Like Freud relies a lot more on myths than like proper history, and Marcuse is going back and being like, actually, we can trace these events within these current societies, and then that's where the Oedipal myth actually comes from, and that's how we base it. We put it in material reality and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'm just like, man, you're still using a lot of the mythological language. Like it makes sense when you're using these examples a little bit more, but I'm still kind of disappointed. I was hoping for a little bit more like revolutionary talk here.
Yeah, I guess like he's still treating from what you're describing, he's still treating the unconscious as a theater. It's just that it's
instead of a production
rather than mythology. And it's like, and basically like for Deleuze and Guattari, it's about making for Guattari at least, it's about making them unconscious machinic rather than theatrical.
Yeah.
So basically like the unconscious isn't a bunch of representations. It's this much more primordial stuff, this primordial non-representative, it's not a reflection of something, it is a bunch of forces in its own right. Yeah.
I don't want to take us too long because we're almost at the 2-hour mark.
Yeah.
I think we accidentally covered in every hole that was left out by the other reading group. Both of these in concert, I think, does give a pretty good understanding of this first chapter. I'm glad, as somebody who's going to be writing about this book in about 3 months, to have been at all 2 sessions. And I would ask that anybody who's somehow listened to the entirety of this session, if they haven't, to listen to the first session, even though I know I only have like 250 subscribers on YouTube. But any final remarks leaving in this chapter? I know we got it through a lot in this 2-hour period.
Final remarks.
If there is an ability to say anything final about this book, anything we missed that you kind of really were like thinking beforehand, it's like, oh, I wanted to talk about this, and we just didn't get to it as well.
I mean, I think it's a bit more fun to just leave people hanging.
Hanging?
Totally not an excuse for not being able to think of anything.
Yeah, this is a cliffhanger for section 2, session 1. Tune in tune in on, what will that be?
I think
Thursday, the 22nd of June.
I think that one of the difficulties with this. Sorry, give me a second.
You're all good.
My cat wanted out.
That's understandable.
He was asleep on my bed the entire time, wakes up right at the end. Yeah, but I think like one of my difficulties with this first chapter is that it is a lot more abstract than, from what I've seen, the next couple chapters will be, because it's basically psychoanalysis and familialism, savages, barbarians, civilized men. Like that's, from what I've seen, that's more specific. They're kind of like going through structures, certain phenomena, whereas this one is laying down the terms.
Yeah, it is a very metaphysical chapter. That's kind of a lot of the problems with this. This is really this, and kind of the second chapter for the people who are not very steeped in psychoanalysis, is kind of the hurdle towards the further understanding of Anti-Oedipus. Like, this is where I stopped when I first tried to read it, because I mean it is the beginning, so obviously. But I mean, it is the hard terms, but if you're able to get past it, if you're able to get past the first day or two reading this, it does become more rewarding as it goes on. I know Vernon Sisney, I believe his most recent appearance on the Machine You Can Conscious Happy Hour, was reflecting on the last time he was able to teach Deleuze, and Deleuze specifically, at least, if not a class on Deleuze and Guattari, where he thought it would possibly, the possible best reading of this was starting from the fourth chapter, starting from the introduction to schizoanalysis, and getting at the final conclusions of what they're trying to set the ground for, and the political liberation that they're trying to provide the guide for. And then you get to see where they end up, and then you start back up. It's like, okay, I know where they're going to end up. Now I know how to orient the way I'm going to use these terms in my reading as I go through, if I'm going to do a functional reading.
Yeah, I think that's I would like levy a like criticism of at least the book, not necessarily Deleuze and Guattari, but like just the book and how people kind of go into it, because like from what I've seen, the introduction to schizoanalysis, what it does is that it actually lays down the stakes of the project, whereas the first chapter, in a sense, it throws you into the deep end. But the problem with it, which is like, I mean, that's fine in general, but like basically it doesn't really give us a reason to care.
That is probably the reason you should start at the end. Is like, okay, now I know what I'm looking and caring about.
Yeah, and it's also in basic, like just in general, I think like I think too many philosophical texts are written, or at least they read as though the author has already assumed the reader is on board with it. Basically, it's like, it's not all that introductory. It's just like, well, you're here, obviously you're completely invested in what I'm doing, so I'm just going to throw the terminology at you like a brick. So like,
I mean, they do have some good words to get you invested at the beginning. I mean, that first little, what is the section? It eats, it shits, it fucks, whatever. It is at work everywhere. It is kind of a pretty entailing beginning. But I guess if those are your final thoughts, we can I can say the goodbyes.
Yeah, I think those are my final thoughts.
Well, thank you for joining me. I'm hoping I mean, we do have, I believe, about 15 members of this reading group, so I'm hoping for session 2 it does end up being more than 4 and 2 people for the 2 reading group sessions.
It was kind of short notice.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. I know it's been 2 hours, so I mean, I'm a little tired now. I imagine you're probably about the same.
This is the highlight of my week, dude.
Well, thank you for joining me. I'm just so glad that other people are able to go through the reading of Anti-Oedipus with me. Yeah, and if you're interested, as I said at the beginning of this session, for the people watching on YouTube, this is still until August. This is an open reading group. Come in, even if we're past this chapter. Try and read it on your own, please, before going on to sections 2, 3. Maybe you can start at 4, but please, if you're interested in this book, whether it's the Minnesota or the other translation, I forget what books or what book companies produce this book, but please come and join us if you're genuinely interested in trying to discuss these ideas. If you genuinely enjoy the reading group VODs, if you're willing to sit here for 2 hours, I would inspire you to join the Discord and at least talk about it, because that's a lot of commitment there already. Everything will be in there below. The syllabus that I can still edit is down there. I believe it's a Google Doc link. The Discord link is there. Just like I said at the beginning, just specify in the introduction or general channel that you want to join the reading group, and we can get you in there. But I hope this 2-hour session has been very productive and helped you understand maybe either what the previous reading group left out or your own personal reading of Anti-Oedipus. I know I'm very partial towards tangents, and maybe Sam is as well. So that's not going to be helpful for everybody, but hopefully we helped at least one person. But kind of want to do it just for the joke. Like and subscribe and comment or whatever. I don't know how to end a YouTube video, but thanks for watching, please. Or thanks for watching. I'll be uploading more reading group sessions in about 2 weeks. We do 2-week intervals if you're going to join. Goodbye.